Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lecture we are going to create few Lambda functions and we are going to use our dynamic table that we created in our last lecture, and taking that table as example we are going to create functions which will do CRUD operations. We will create a user, then we will also update the user and fetch all the users from our DynamoDB table, and then also delete the user. In the process we will use different methods like get, post, put and delete. We will also create a custom role for Lambda function which will give us permission to access the DynamoDB table, and we will also see different operations available under AWS SDK to add, update, fetch and delete items from DynamoDB table. So let's get started. So I'm back to my Visual Studio Code serverless YAML file. The first Lambda function we're going to add is to create a user. So we already have a function from our previous section, so I'm going to just rename the post function to create user. So here we have named our function as user. Our handler is mapped to create user function under the user.js file. Here we are going to create that in a moment, and then as an event we have http post method as the event, and this is our path. Now I'll go back to user.js file to rename my exported function as create user. In our root directory let's create a folder called utils, and under this folder I'm going to create response.js file. I just want to keep my response object, whether an error or a success message, inside response.js and export it from there. So I'm just going to copy this. Let's just remove this for a moment, and under response.js I'm going to export module, and then I'm going to put property as success and then copy the success code. I don't want to set the body here, we will set it dynamically, but our status code will always be 200 for a success call. Is base 64 encoded will be false by default. So is base 64 encoded needs to be true if you remember, only in cases when we are sending back a binary file as attachment and response. In rest of the cases it will stay as false. I'm going to keep the access control origin as star in the headers. Also going to add error object here. So in case of errors I would want to send 400 as response code, and everything else remains the same. Let's fix the errors. Am I missing? Okay, so okay, you're good here. Cool. And inside my user.js file I'm just going to import this file. Utils and then response. So now in all the functions we will create, we can use the common response imported from our utils directory and then modify before sending it back to user. Now inside our create user function we will receive the event and the context. So the body that we'll send along with our post request will be contained inside our event. So I'm going to just log the event that we receive. Let's log the event.body, and then this body will be in JSON format. So let's save it and let's parse it and then save it in a constant called body. After this, I'm just going to write some pseudocode here. We would want to save the user in our table and get back a response, right? Or catch errors and get back response. Now to save user in table in DynamoDB table, we will need the DynamoDB table name, right? Now to get the table name inside our function, we need to pass the table name as an environment variable to this function. Now when we created the table, we had the table name stored in under the custom attribute in serverless YAML file. Now what we can do is, because this table name will be used across multiple functions, I can add it under the provider section so that it's available across the whole serverless YAML, all the functions. So under provider section, I'll add an environment variable and then just put table users table, and I can put the name as, I'll pick it from under custom section. So this will be self custom dot the variable we set under there. That's it. Now this user table variable should be available across all the functions that we'll set, including the user function here, and we should be able to import it here. So what I will do is I will import users table from our process.env, right? And we are going to use this table name to pass to a function, the next function that we will create to save our user to DynamoDB. Now let's add another file under utils section. Let's call it dynamodb.js. So we are going to create all our DynamoDB related functions here and export them. Now we need to import the AWS class from AWS SDK. Now this SDK is available across all the Lambda functions, and you do not have to add this SDK in node modules. This is available by default to all the functions that you deploy to AWS. And this SDK provides you different libraries to interact with different AWS components, services, including DynamoDB. So for DynamoDB, we need to import, or we need to create a new instance of DynamoDB document client. So here we are creating a document client to interact with your DynamoDB tables and perform all the different operations. And because we are creating a user, we are going to, let's say, save the user's password as well, and I want to encrypt the password before saving it to DynamoDB. To encrypt the password, I'm going to use a library called bcrypt.js. Now this library is not available by default in your Lambda function environment, so we will have to import it in our package.json file. So I'm going back to my project here, and then simply install and save it in my package JSON file, pcrypt.js. So our package is installed. This should be saved in our package JSON file as well. Yeah, great. Let's go back to so let's go back to our DynamoDB.js file. So we have all the requirements to interact with our DynamoDB. Now I'm going to create a simple function here called create user. It will be a async function which will receive the item to be added to DynamoDB table and also the table name. We can have multiple tables, so I'm going to create a generic function here. Now I want to put everything under try catch. Now if you remember, in our serverless YAML file we had email, country and created at as mandatory fields that we need to pass while creating the user. If you want the user to be saved to DynamoDB table. So now when we create our user, we will pass the mandatory fields that we had while creating the table, email, country and created at, and we will also add a created at and updated at attribute when we create a user or update a user. So here I'm going to get a timestamp, which is nothing but the current time. Yeah, we are going to use the DynamoDB put method from the client that we created earlier. Now this method is used to create a item in DynamoDB table, and it receives a parameters object let's call it params, and then we will promisify. So .promise is available in the latest SDKs, so you can just simply add .promise method to promisify this call. Now we need to define the parameters. Now to create a new item in DynamoDB, we need to set the table name in which we want to create the item, and also we need to pass the item itself. So in this case we want to copy everything that we receive as post call, that we are passing it here to this function, and also we are going to add created at parameter set to timestamp, and then updated at also set to timestamp. Right, so here you see that along with the mandatory fields that we need to pass inside the parameters, we can also add additional fields. Like, so DynamoDB is flexible in that way, it's structureless. Okay, that's it. That's all you need to create a new item. Right, so we're passing the parameter in the put method and then sending back the response to the calling function, which will be here. Now inside the catch block, let's just print the error for now, and then throw it. That's it. And then obviously we need to export this function. That's all. Now let's go back to our user.js. We will have to import this function from DynamoDB.js file. and then call it here. Now let's say we save the response that we get into a response variable and then create user, and we'll pass the body that we receive from our post call and then the table name that we get from the environment variable. Let's log the response here, and then finally we will return the response to our user. Now here I want to use our response object. Now in case of success it will be all the attributes inside response.success and add the body. Now the body has to be JSON stringified, so we are just sending back whatever the response we get after adding the item to database, right? Now here I also want to put everything in our try catch block. So in case of errors, we'll catch all the errors and then send back a response. Now in case of error it will be response and then the error block, and add the body as whatever the error we receive. Oops, let's remove this. That's it. We have our create function ready and we can test it. Now before testing I want to deploy it to AWS. So I'm going to just run the deploy command once again. So our deployment is complete here and we are ready to test it. I'm going to copy my API gateway path. Now inside Postman I have a project TGG3 folder that I have created. I'm going to add a new request. Now this is to create a user. I'm going to copy the URL, the API gateway URL, paste it here. This is a post call, and then the path was user. Now this is a post call, so I'm going to add a JSON object with all the required parameters and some additional ones. So I'm going to add an email, next we needed a password, let's just put it as password, and the third requirement was country. And then I'll also add the first name and last name. Right, we need to set the body as JSON. Great, now we can test it. So we are receiving an error here. It's an access denied exception, and it just tells you that your Lambda function is not authorized to perform DynamoDB put item operation. Right, so we need to give our Lambda function permission to access DynamoDB table and then perform put item operation on it. And to do that, we need to create a custom policy. So in the next lecture, we will see how we can create a custom role and assign it to Lambda function.